He thought the sounds outside were coyotes. He was wrong, dead wrong. Willis Hargrove had spent 20 years letting the silence of his Montana homestead seep into his bones. He knew the whisper of wind through barbed wire, the skittering of mice in the walls, the mournful cry of a lone coyote under a sliver of moon. He knew the language of loneliness, but this was different. It was a soft sound, a wet, rhythmic chewing. It was desperate. He'd been sitting on his porch, the old wood groaning under his weight, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sweating in his hand. The sun had bled out behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, leaving the sky bruised purple and black. A cold was setting in, the kind that didn't just bite your skin, but seemed to latch onto your soul. He set the bottle down. The sound came again, from the direction of the old barn. It wasn't an animal feasting on a kill. There was no tearing, no guttural satisfaction. This was a sound of pure, grinding hunger. The sound of teeth working on something that refused to give. He grabbed the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Not because he was scared. He hadn't been scared of anything since the day he buried his wife, Martha, and their stillborn daughter in the same cold ground 7 years ago. After that, there was nothing left for the world to take. He grabbed the rifle because he knew that sound, and whatever was making it wasn't natural. He stepped off the porch, his boots making no sound on the frost-kissed dirt. The air was so still he could hear his own heartbeat, a slow, tired drum against his ribs. He moved toward the barn, hugging the shadows, the rifle held low but ready. The chewing stopped. Then started again, faster this time, more frantic. He rounded the corner of the barn and his blood ran cold. It wasn't a coyote. It was a boy. No older than 7 or 8, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, crouched beside a pile of rotting apples Willis had dumped there weeks ago. The boy's hands were raw, chapped, and trembling as he clawed through the blackened, mushy fruit, searching for a piece that was merely rotten instead of putrid. He found one, a shriveled thing the color of old bruises, and crammed it into his mouth, core, seeds, and all. Willis's throat seized up. The rifle suddenly felt heavy, useless. He couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The world narrowed to this one horrifying image, a child eating garbage like a starving dog. He thought the boy was alone. But then, a flicker of movement near the rusted hayrake. 2 more figures, smaller still. A girl, maybe 5, with hair so matted with dirt and straw it was impossible to tell its color. And huddled behind her, a tiny thing, a toddler barely big enough to stand, wrapped in what looked like a tattered potato sack. The girl saw him first. She froze. The half-eaten rotten apple she held fell from her fingers and landed with a soft thud in the dirt. Her eyes, huge and dark in her grimy face, widened with a terror so profound it felt ancient. It was the look of an animal that has only ever known the cage and the stick, bracing for a blow that was sure to come. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stood up, placed her tiny body in front of the 2 boys, and prepared to be hit. It was the most heartbreaking thing Willis had ever seen. "Don't run," Willis said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp he barely recognized as his own. He lowered the rifle, setting it gently on the ground. He dropped to one knee, trying to make himself smaller, less of a threat. The children didn't move. They stared at him, their faces pale masks of exhaustion and fear in the fading light. It wasn't trust that held them there. It was something far worse. It was the complete and utter surrender of those who have nothing left to lose. The little girl, the one standing guard, spoke. Her voice was a bare whisper, carried on the cold wind. "We're sorry, mister. He's real hungry. We'll go now." Willis shook his head slowly. "You from around here? From town?" Silence. The older boy started coughing, a dry, racking sound that shook his whole frame. He doubled over, but he never let go of the rotten apple in his fist. "Didn't think so," Willis said, his gaze sweeping the dark, empty horizon. No wagon, no campfire, no sign of an adult. just three small children in rags against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the plains. "You got folks?" The girl's chin trembled. Her eyes welled up with tears that cut clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "Mama, she got the fever, died 3 nights back." Willis felt a punch to his gut, sharp and painful. 3 nights. They'd been alone for 3 nights. "She told us to follow the fences," the girl whispered. She said good men live near barns." The wind howled then, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the ghosts of all the lonely souls who had ever walked this land. And in that moment, Willis could have sworn he felt something inside his chest. Something he thought had turned to stone years ago, crack right down the middle. "What's your name, child?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Myra." "And them?" He nodded toward the boys. "That's Theo," she said, pointing to the older one. "And the little one's Jody. He don't talk much." Willis looked at their clothes, threadbare rags offering no protection from the biting cold. He looked at their bare feet, blue and cracked. He looked at their faces, pinched with a hunger so deep it was almost spiritual. Good men live near barns. The words echoed in his head, a judgment and a plea all at once. He had spent 7 years building walls around his heart, a fortress of solitude to keep the pain out. He had buried his future, his joy, his very soul on that hill next to Martha. But as he looked at these 3 starving children huddled in the shadow of his barn, chewing on his rotten apples, he knew. He just knew. The walls were about to come crashing down. "Come on," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He stood up, his old bones groaning in protest. "Let's get you inside." They didn't move. They just stared, suspended between hope and terror. Myra's eyes narrowed, filled with a suspicion far older than her years. "Why? Why would you help us?" Willis looked at her, at this tiny, fierce girl trying to shield her brothers from a world that had already broken them. He knelt again, getting down on their level, until his weathered face was close to hers. "Because," he said, the words tearing their way out of him. "Someone once told me the same thing, that good men live near barns, and I've spent every day since trying to prove her wrong." He took a ragged breath. "Maybe it's time I started trying to prove her right." He held out his hand. After a long, trembling moment, Myra took it. Her fingers were as cold as ice, and as he led the 3 orphans out of the darkness and into the faint, warm light of his home, Willis Hargrove felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. A purpose. And it terrified him more than the silence ever had. The cabin was small, just 1 room, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. A fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth. Willis gestured to the simple wooden bench near the warmth. "Sit. Get warm." The children moved like ghosts, their eyes wide, taking in the meager comforts of the room, as if it were a palace. They huddled together on the bench, not speaking, barely breathing. Jody, the smallest, had his thumb in his mouth, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Willis didn't say much. Words felt clumsy, loud. Instead, he moved to the stove and lifted the heavy iron pot. Yesterday's stew. Venison and potatoes. Not much, but it was hot, and it was food. He ladled it into 3 chipped enamel bowls, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul. He set the bowls on the table. The smell filled the small space, rich and savory. He watched as Theo, the oldest, reached for a bowl with a hand that shook so badly he almost dropped it. He didn't use the spoon. He lifted the bowl to his lips and drank the stew down in great gulping swallows. Myra was more careful. She fed a spoonful to Jody first, blowing on it gently, before taking a small, hesitant bite herself. Her eyes closed for a moment, and Willis saw a single tear escape and trace a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of relief so profound it was painful to watch. They ate until the bowls were scraped clean. Theo fell asleep right there at the table, his head slumping forward until it rested on his folded arms. Jody curled into Myra's side, his breathing finally evening out into the deep, peaceful rhythm of sleep. Willis sat across the room in his rocking chair, the rifle back in its place by the door. He just watched them. 3 small bodies breathing in his house. The silence he had cultivated for so long was gone, replaced by the soft sounds of life. It was an invasion. It was a miracle. "I don't got much," he said finally, his voice low in the quiet room. Myra looked up, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but clear and intelligent. "You got a roof and food. There's work, too," he said. "Always work on a place like this. Chopping wood, mending fences, feeding the chickens." He saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. "You mean you'd let us stay?" He looked at the sleeping forms of her brothers. He thought of the empty nights, the hollow days, the crushing weight of a life lived only for oneself. He had thought that was peace. He realized now it had just been a slow death. "I mean," he said, meeting her gaze, "I ain't about to toss 3 kids back out into the frost." Myra didn't smile. The world had taken smiles from her long ago, but she nodded, a single solemn gesture of understanding. A pact. "I can work," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I can scrub pots. Theo can fix things. He's good with his hands. Jody can't do much, but he don't cry much either." A ghost of a smile touched Willis's lips, the first in years. It felt foreign, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "You'll stay the night," he said. "We'll see what tomorrow brings." She nodded again, then carefully curled her arms around Jody, pulling him closer. That night, Willis didn't go to his bed. He stayed in the rocking chair, the rifle resting across his lap. He wasn't afraid the children would run. He was afraid someone might come looking for them. He didn't know their story, not really. He didn't know who they were running from, or what kind of trouble followed them like a shadow. But as he sat there in the dark, listening to the soft breathing of the 3 orphans who had stumbled into his life, he knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow. He'd bury anyone who tried to take them. The first rays of dawn painted the cabin window a dusty gray. Willis hadn't slept. He had watched the fire burn down to embers, his mind a whirlwind. For 7 years, his life had been a flat, straight line of chores and grief. Now it was a tangled knot of questions. Who were these children? Where had they really come from? And what was he, a broken old man, supposed to do with them? A floorboard creaked. He didn't move, just opened his eyes. It was Myra. She was standing by the hearth, her small frame silhouetted against the dying coals. She was trying to lift the heavy iron kettle. "Want help with that?" he asked. She jumped, startled. "Didn't mean to wake you, sir." "Wasn't sleepin'." He rose from the rocking chair, his joints popping like firecrackers. He took the kettle from her small hands, filled it from the pump by the door, and set it on the hook over the fire. She watched him, her expression serious. "I thought I could make some oats," she said. "I watched Mama do it." Soon the other 2 were awake, Theo quiet and watchful as ever. Jody, who woke with a rattling cough and immediately sought out his sister, clinging to her leg like a baby koala. The smell of hot oats filled the cabin. It was a simple, comforting smell, a smell of home. Willis filled 3 bowls, more than he would have ever made for himself. The children ate with a quiet focus, their hunger still a raw, living thing inside them. "This man," Willis said, breaking the silence, "the one who owned the ranch you were on, what was his name?" Theo looked up, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He glanced at Myra. "Don't matter," Myra said quickly. "We ain't going back." "Didn't ask if you were," Willis said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I asked his name." Theo swallowed. "Mr. Holler," he mumbled. "Elmore Holler." Willis knew the name. Holler owned the biggest spread for 50 miles, a place with pristine white fences and a reputation as cold as a banker's heart. Holler was a man who went to church on Sunday and foreclosed on his neighbors on Monday. A man who talked about charity but practiced cruelty. If he had thrown these children out to starve, Willis's hands tightened into fists. "I'm riding out that way today," he said, his voice flat. Myra's head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. "Why? Please don't. If he knows where we are—" "He won't," Willis said. "And even if he did, he's not getting near this cabin, or you." He looked at Theo. "I'm just going to ask a few questions." He hitched his mule to the small wagon an hour later. "Don't open this door for anyone," he told Myra. "Not unless you hear 3 knocks loud and slow. You hear me?" "Yes, sir," she said, her small face a mask of worry. She stood on the porch, watching him ride away, a tiny general guarding her post. The ride to Holler's ranch was cold. The wind whipped across the plains, carrying the promise of snow, but Willis barely felt it. A slow, hot anger was burning in his chest. He found Holler on the sprawling porch of his immaculate ranch house, sipping coffee from a china cup. The man was large, his belly straining the buttons of his vest. He had a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Well, well," Holler said, his voice oozing false geniality. "If it isn't the hermit of Red Hollow, what brings you out of your cave?" Willis didn't dismount. He looked down at the man from the back of his mule. "Heard you had a family working for you, a woman named Edith with 3 kids. Holler's smile faltered for a second. "The woman got sick, couldn't work. I'm running a business, Hargrove, not a charity hospital." They were dead weight. "So you threw them out," Willis said, his voice dangerously low. "A dying woman and 3 small children, in the middle of winter. I told them to leave. They left," Holler said with a shrug. "What happened to them after that ain't my concern." "Their ma died," Willis said, the words like chips of ice. "Did you know that, Holler? She died out there in the cold because of you." "She didn't die on my land," Holler snapped, his face turning red. "That makes it none of my business." "You think God sees property lines?" Willis shot back. The words surprised him. He hadn't spoken of God in years. Holler's eyes narrowed into slits. "Are you threatening me, Hargrove?" "No," Willis said, pulling the reins of his mule. "I'm telling you, forget their names, forget their faces. If you ever come looking for them, if you ever so much as whisper their names in town, I will come back, and we'll have a very different conversation." He turned the mule and rode away, not looking back. He could feel Holler's hateful stare on his back, a physical weight. But the anger in his chest had been replaced by something else, a cold, hard resolve. It was dusk by the time he got back. A warm yellow light glowed in the cabin window. Smoke curled from the chimney. He knocked 3 times, loud and slow. The door creaked open. Myra peered out, then her face flooded with relief. He stepped inside. The cabin was warm. A pot was bubbling on the stove. Jody ran to him and wrapped his arms around his leg, burying his face in his trousers. "You came back," the little boy whispered. Willis reached down and lifted him up. The child was impossibly light. "Told you I would," he said, his voice thick. Jody laid his head on Willis's shoulder and didn't move. It felt right. Later that night, after a quiet dinner, Myra approached him. She was fidgeting with the frayed sleeve of her dress. "Mr. Hargrove?" "Willis," he corrected gently. She nodded. "Willis. Jody. He doesn't know what to call you. He keeps trying to say a word. I told him not to, but—" Willis waited. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He keeps calling you Papa." The word hit Willis like a physical blow. Papa. A word he had longed to hear. A word he had buried with his daughter. A ghost of a name, now resurrected on the lips of a child who was not his own. He couldn't speak. His throat was a knot of fire and grief and something else, something new and terrifying and wonderful. "You don't have to let him," Myra said quickly, mistaking his silence for anger. "I can tell him to stop. I'm sorry." "No," Willis rasped, finding his voice. It's fine. Let him." She gave him a small, uncertain smile and retreated to the corner where her brothers slept. Long after the children were asleep, Willis sat in his rocking chair, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The cabin was quiet again, but it wasn't the same crushing silence as before. It was a silence filled with the breath of sleeping children. Papa. The word echoed in the quiet corners of his heart. It didn't feel like a ghost anymore. It felt like a second chance, and he swore to whatever God might be listening that this time he wouldn't fail. The next few days settled into a fragile routine. It was a dance of strangers learning each other's rhythms. Willis learned that Theo was quiet, but missed nothing, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. He learned that Myra had a fierce, protective streak, but also a gentle touch, the way she hummed to Jody when he had nightmares. And he learned that Jody, once he felt safe, was a whirlwind of silent curiosity, his small hands exploring every nook and cranny of the cabin. They were a fractured, makeshift family, held together by shared trauma and the simple warmth of the hearth. But the outside world has a way of creeping in. A week after his visit to Holler's ranch, a man on a dusty horse appeared at Willis's fence line. He wasn't from around here. He had the hard, squinting eyes of a man who spent his life looking for things that didn't want to be found. "Howdy," the man called out. He had a smile that was all teeth. "Name's Russ Kelter. Heard you might have seen some stray kids wandering through here." Willis was chopping wood. He didn't stop. He just rested the axe on the block. Myra, who had been hanging laundry, froze. "Ain't seen any," Willis said, his voice flat. Kelter chuckled. "Funny, 'cause folks in town say you've been buying a lot more flour than a single man needs. Says you're feeding extra mouths." The town. The whispers had started. Willis knew they would. Loneliness makes a man invisible. A family makes him a target. "Got generous neighbors," Willis said, not blinking. "Is that so?" Kelter's eyes scanned the property, lingering on the small shirts hanging on the line. "Well, there's a reward out for 'em, a handsome one. Seems their mama owed a powerful man some money before she passed. He wants his property back." Property. The word hung in the air, ugly and cold. "They ain't property," Willis said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "They're children." Kelter just shrugged, that predatory smile still on his face. "Money's money. You see 'em, you send word to Sheriff Barnes in town. He'll know who to contact." He tipped his hat. "Have a blessed day, friend." He rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Myra ran to him, her face pale with terror. "He knows. They're going to come for us." "Let them come," Willis said, but his own heart was pounding. A reward. That changed everything. Now it wasn't just a cruel rancher or a nosy sheriff. Now it was about money. And men would do anything for money. That night, the nightmares came back for Jody. He woke up screaming, thrashing in his blankets. "The man with the red boots! He's coming!" Willis rushed to his side, gathering the trembling boy in his arms. "Shh, you're safe. It was just a dream." "No!" Jody sobbed, clinging to him. "He had a rope. He said he was going to take me. Said I wasn't yours." Willis held him tight, rocking him back and forth. A man with red boots. It was a child's nightmare, but it felt chillingly real. It was the face of the nameless, faceless threat that now hunted them. He knew then they couldn't just wait. He had to do something. The next morning, he gathered the children around the table. His face was grim. He reached up to the dusty mantel over the fireplace and took down a small, locked wooden box. A box he hadn't opened in 7 years. He opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a tarnished silver star, a lawman's badge. Theo's eyes widened. "You were a sheriff?" "Deputy," Willis corrected. "A long time ago, before I met Martha. I put it down when she got sick. Decided being a husband was more important." Myra stared at the badge. "Why are you showing us this?" "Because that man, Kelter, he works for someone with money and power," Willis said. "And the local Sheriff Barnes, he'll listen to money over morals any day of the week. This badge won't stop them, but it reminds me of who I used to be. A man who stood for the law, a man who protected people." He looked at each of them, his gaze intense. The law they're bringing ain't the real law. It's the law of bullies and greed, and I won't let it touch this family. He closed the box. We're not running. We're going to fight. A week passed in tense silence. Every snapping twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of fear through the cabin. Willis taught Theo how to shoot the rifle. He taught Myra how to bar the door and the windows. They were preparing for a siege. Then, one night, they came. Not one man, but 3. They rode up to the cabin in the dead of night, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. At the front was the bounty hunter, Kelter. With him were 2 other men, rough-looking types with ropes coiled at their saddles. Willis met them on the porch, his own rifle in his hands. The children were hidden in the root cellar, the trap door covered by a rug. "Evening, Hargrove," Kelter sneered. "We've come for the property." "You're on my land," Willis said, his voice cold as steel. "Turn around and leave." Kelter laughed. "We have a legal claim, signed by a judge. The children are wards of the county, to be given over to their mother's creditor. You're harboring fugitives. That's a crime." "And letting children starve is a virtue?" Willis shot back. "We're not leaving without them," Kelter said, dismounting. The other 2 followed, spreading out, their intentions clear. They were going to storm the cabin. Willis raised his rifle. "The first man who takes a step onto this porch will be the first man to die on it." The men hesitated. They were bounty hunters, not soldiers. They weren't looking for a gunfight. "You're 1 man," Kelter snarled. "We're 3. He's not 1 man." A new voice cut through the darkness. From the shadows of the barn, a figure emerged. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a sheriff's star pinned to his coat. It was Abe Madden, the old sheriff from the next county over, a man Willis had served with years ago. A man he had sent a desperate message to via a friendly trapper just days before, and Abe wasn't alone. Behind him were 2 more deputies. Kelter's face went pale. "Madden? What are you doing here? This ain't your jurisdiction." "Maybe not," Abe said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "But friendship is, and my friend here tells me some vultures are trying to pick off his family. Now I see a legal claim in your hand, but I also see 3 men threatening a man on his own property. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on your horses, and you're going to ride out of my sight. And if I ever hear you've come back, the next warrant I serve will have your name on it." Kelter stared at Abe, then at Willis, his face a mask of fury and frustration. He knew he was outmatched. He spat on the ground, muttered a curse, and got back on his horse. The 3 men rode off into the darkness, defeated. Abe walked onto the porch. He looked at Willis, a sad smile on his face. "You always did attract trouble, Willis." "This is good trouble, Abe," Willis said, a wave of relief washing over him. "I know," Abe said, "but this ain't over. The man who hired them, he won't give up this easy. He's got money. He'll just find a more legal way to do it next time." Willis knew he was right. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. He went inside and opened the trap door. The children scrambled out, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. Jody ran to him, burying his face in his legs. "The bad men are gone?" "They're gone for now," Willis said, stroking the boy's hair. That night, as the children slept, Willis and Abe sat by the fire. "What are you going to do?" Abe asked. Willis looked at the sleeping children. Myra, Theo, Jody, his family. "I'm going to adopt them," he said, the words surprising even himself. "Legally. I'm going to make them mine so no one can ever call them property again." Abe raised an eyebrow. "You know what that entails? Lawyers, judges, the whole town sticking their nose in your business. The man who wants them will fight you every step of the way." "I know," Willis said, "but I've been running from a fight my whole life. The fight for a family. I'm not running anymore." He looked at the tarnished badge still sitting on the mantel. He had put it down to be a husband. Now, he would have to pick up a different kind of fight to be a father. and as the first light of dawn crept into the cabin, Willis Hargrove felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. It wasn't the peace of solitude, it was the peace of a man who had finally found his battlefield, and he would die on it before he surrendered. The decision to adopt the children was like dropping a boulder into a still pond. The ripples spread fast. Willis rode into town with Abe the next day to file the initial paperwork with the county clerk. The news hit the small town of Prairie Ridge like a lightning strike. The whispers that had been confined to the general store now became open speculation on front porches and condemnation in the pews of the church. The hermit of Red Hollow, the strange, grieving man who kept to himself, was trying to claim 3 filthy orphans as his own, and one of them, they said with hushed, scandalized tones, was a woman. Not a child, but a young woman living with him. The morality police came out in force. The first to officially object was Elmore Holler. He filed a counterclaim, stating the children were indentured to him, a debt left by their deceased mother. It was a lie, but a lie backed by his wealth and influence. The second was the town council, led by the preacher, Reverend Miles. They filed a petition declaring Willis an unfit guardian, citing his reclusive nature, his lack of a wife, and the moral ambiguity of his living situation with Myra. Willis found himself in a war fought not with rifles, but with paper and prejudice. The circuit judge was due to arrive in a month. That's how long Willis had to prove he could be a father. Life in the cabin became a strange mix of domesticity and desperation. Willis and the children worked from sunup to sundown to turn the rundown homestead into a proper home. They repaired the leaky roof of the barn. They planted a small winter garden. Theo, with a natural talent for mechanics, fixed the broken water pump. Myra, with a quiet efficiency, turned the dark, dusty cabin into a clean, bright space. But under the surface, the tension was unbearable. Every trip to town for supplies was an ordeal. Old friends of Willis's would suddenly be too busy to talk to him. Miss Tansy at the store would serve him with a tight-lipped disapproval. One day, Reverend Miles himself paid a visit. He stood on the porch, his Bible in his hand, his face a mask of pious concern. "Willis," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "the town is worried. These children need a proper Christian home, a mother and a father. What you are doing here, it's not natural." "What's not natural," Willis said, his voice dangerously calm, "is a town full of so-called Christians who would let 3 children starve to death." The Reverend's face hardened. "They are not your children. Give this up, Willis. Let the county handle them. It's for the best." "The best for who, Reverend?" Willis shot back. "For you, so you don't have to look at them and be reminded of your own hypocrisy?" The preacher left in a huff, his righteous indignation trailing behind him, but his words lingered. They were losing. The town, Holler, the law, they were all closing in. The children felt it too. Theo became even more quiet and withdrawn. Myra worked herself to exhaustion, as if trying to scrub away the stain of their past. Only Jody seemed oblivious, his world having shrunk to the safe confines of the cabin and the man he called Papa. One afternoon, Willis was teaching Theo how to sight the rifle. The boy was a natural, his hands steady, his eyes sharp. "Why are you teaching me this?" Theo asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think they're going to come and—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Willis put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm teaching you because a man needs to know how to protect his family, and you're the man of this family when I'm not here." Theo looked up at him, his young face filled with a gravity that broke Willis's heart. "They're going to take us away, aren't they?" Willis didn't have an answer. For the first time, he felt a flicker of despair. That night, a storm rolled in, a furious tempest of wind and rain that rattled the very bones of the cabin. In the middle of the storm, Jody woke up with a fever. It started small, but by morning he was burning up, his breathing shallow and ragged. Willis knew this kind of fever. It was the same one that had taken his own mother when he was a boy. It moved fast, and it was deadly. The town doctor, a man beholden to Holler and the town council, would never come out to the cabin. Not for them. Myra was frantic, bathing Jody's forehead with cool cloths, her face a mask of terror. "We can't lose him, Willis. We can't." Willis looked at the sick child, then at the storm raging outside. There was only one hope, a risky one. "There's a woman," he said to Myra, "a healer, lives up in the mountains. They call her a witch, but she knows herbs. She knows more than any doctor. Her name is Ruthie." "But the storm—" "I have to try," he said. He bundled the feverish child in every blanket they had and carried him out to the barn. He saddled his strongest horse. "Let me go with you," Theo pleaded. "No," Willis said, his voice firm. "You stay here, protect Myra, bar the door, don't open it for anyone." He mounted the horse, the small, hot bundle of his son pressed against his chest. "I'll be back," he yelled over the howl of the wind, and he rode out into the storm, a desperate father on a desperate mission. The wind tore at him, the rain blinded him, but he spurred the horse on, his mind a frantic prayer. The journey was a nightmare. Trees had fallen across the path. The trail was a river of mud. The horse stumbled and slipped, but Willis held on, shielding Jody with his own body. The child's breathing was getting weaker, his small body frighteningly still. He was losing him. Just as he felt the last of his hope guttering out, he saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. Ruthie's cabin. He burst through the door, a wild man covered in mud and rain, the child in his arms. "Help me," he gasped. "Please, my son." Ruthie was an old woman with eyes as clear and sharp as a winter sky. She took one look at the child and didn't waste a second. She took Jody from him and laid him by the fire, her gnarled hands moving with a practiced urgency, stripping off his wet clothes, examining him. "Mountain fever," she said, her voice raspy. "Bad, but not too late." For the next few hours, she worked her magic. She brewed foul-smelling teas from herbs Willis had never seen before. She made a poultice and applied it to Jody's chest. She chanted in a low, ancient language as she worked. Willis could only watch, helpless, his heart a raw, bleeding wound. He had faced down bounty hunters and sheriffs. But this was a battle he couldn't fight. All he could do was pray to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Towards dawn, the storm broke, and so did the fever. Jody's breathing deepened. The fire in his skin cooled. He opened his eyes and looked at Willis. "Papa," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. Willis choked back a sob and knelt by his side. "I'm here, son. I'm here." He had done it. He had saved him. He returned to the cabin 2 days later, a weak but recovering Jody in his arms. Theo and Myra fell upon them, their faces a mixture of relief and joy. But their reunion was short-lived. A notice was nailed to their front door. It was from the circuit judge. The hearing for the adoption and the competing claims was set for the next day. They were out of time. The courtroom was packed. The whole town had turned out to see the spectacle. On one side sat Willis, with Abe Madden by his side. Behind him, Theo and Myra sat huddled together, their faces pale. On the other side sat Elmore Holler, looking smug with his high-priced lawyer. Reverend Miles sat with the town council, a phalanx of self-righteous judgment. The judge was a stern, humorless man named Blackwood. He listened impassively as Holler's lawyer presented his case, producing a fabricated document of indenture, signed with a forged X purported to be their mother's mark. He painted Willis as a dangerous, unstable recluse trying to steal Holler's property. Then the Reverend spoke, his voice dripping with false piety, about the moral decay Willis represented, about the need for a proper family. It was a landslide. Willis could feel it. They were going to lose. When it was his turn, Willis stood up. He didn't have a lawyer. He just had the truth. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm not a fancy man. I don't know much about the law. But I know about love. And I know about loss." He told them about finding the children, starving and alone. He told them about their mother's last words. "Good men live near barns." "I haven't always been a good man," he said, his voice cracking. I've been a broken man, a lonely man. But these children, they put me back together. They taught me how to live again. They're not property, Your Honor. They're my family. They're my heart. He looked at the judge, his eyes pleading. If being a father means fighting for your children, then I'm a father, and I'll fight for them until my last breath. There was a stunned silence in the courtroom. Judge Blackwood stared at Willis, his expression unreadable. Do you have any proof to counter Mr. Holler's claim? The judge asked. Willis's shoulders slumped. No, sir, just my word. The judge sighed. In that case, based on the evidence presented— Wait! A voice from the back of the courtroom. The crowd turned. A woman was pushing her way forward. It was Ruthie, the mountain healer. I have something to say, she said, her voice ringing with authority. She walked to the front of the courtroom and faced the judge. I was the midwife who delivered Edith's children, she said. I was with her when she died. She didn't owe Elmore Holler a damn thing. He lied to her, cheated her out of her wages, and then threw her out when she got sick. Holler jumped to his feet. This is an outrage. This woman is a witch, a crazy old hermit. I'm also the woman who just saved that little boy's life, Ruthie shot back, pointing a long, bony finger at Holler. Which is more than you or any of these so-called good people of this town would have done. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, worn Bible. This was Edith's, she said, handing it to the judge. She made me promise to give it to her children. There's something written inside. The judge opened the Bible. On the inside cover, in a shaky, fading hand, was a message. To my children, Myra, Theo, and Jody, if you are reading this, I am gone. Find a man named Willis Hargrove. His wife, Martha, was my friend long ago. He is a good man. He will keep you safe. He is your guardian now. I give you to him. It was signed, Edith. The courtroom erupted. Holler was sputtering, his face purple. The Reverend looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel. Silence! He looked at the Bible. He looked at Holler's forged document. He looked at Willis, standing tall and proud with his children. Mr. Holler, the judge said, his voice cold as ice, I find your claim to be fraudulent. Furthermore, I am opening an investigation into your business practices. As for you, Reverend, I suggest you reread the book you carry. He turned to Willis. A flicker of something that looked like respect crossed his face. Mr. Hargrove, he said, the law is a clumsy instrument. It cannot measure love, but it can recognize truth. This document, he held up Edith's Bible, is a will, a mother's last will and testament. It is legally binding. He looked out at the silent courtroom, at the children who were now weeping with joy, at the man who had become their father. The petition for adoption is granted. These children are now, and forever, the legal sons and daughter of Willis Hargrove. He slammed the gavel down one last time. This court is adjourned. Willis swept all three children into his arms, tears streaming down his face. They were his. They were finally, truly, his. They walked out of the courtroom, a family. The townspeople parted for them, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and for the first time, a grudging respect. As they stepped out into the bright sunlight, Jody tugged on Willis's shirt. Papa, he said, can we go home now? Willis looked at the faces of his children, his family, his future. He looked up at the wide Montana sky. Yes, son, he said, his voice full of a joy he thought he would never know again. We can go home. And for the first time in a very long time, home was not a place of silence and sorrow. It was a place of laughter and hope and love. It was a place where a good man lived, in a house near a barn. A house that was finally, completely, full. The story of what happened in that courtroom spread through the territory like wildfire. Willis Hargrove, the broken hermit, had become a local legend. But Willis didn't care about legends. He cared about the sound of Jody's laughter, the quiet determination in Theo's eyes, and the steady, calming presence of Myra. Life wasn't easy. Holler was ruined, his empire of greed crumbling under legal investigation. But the resentment in the town lingered, a sour undercurrent. They were still outsiders. Willis knew they couldn't stay in Prairie Ridge. The ghosts were too thick there. Abe Madden helped them find a piece of land in the next valley over, a place called Eagle's Nest. It was wild and beautiful, with a clear running creek and meadows full of wildflowers. It had a small, sturdy cabin and a big, empty barn. It was a place to start over. They built a life there, nail by nail, seed by seed. Willis taught his sons how to hunt and fish, how to read the land and the sky. Myra, who had grown into a strong, capable young woman, ran the household with a wisdom far beyond her years. She and Willis were partners in every sense of the word, their bond forged in the fires of adversity. One summer evening, years later, Willis was sitting on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set. The cabin was filled with the sounds of life. Jody, now a strapping teenager, was arguing with Theo over a game of checkers. Myra was humming as she baked bread. Willis was no longer a young man. His hair was white, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were clear and full of a deep, abiding peace. Myra came out and sat beside him. She handed him a cup of coffee. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly. "That first night?" "Every day," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I think about those rotten apples." She smiled, a real, beautiful smile that still made his heart ache. "Mama was right," she said. "Good men do live near barns." Willis reached out and took her hand. Her fingers fit into his as if they were made to be there. "No," he said, looking at the warm light spilling from the cabin window, at the home he had built, at the family he had fought for. "A good man lives here, because you three showed up and taught him how." He had thought his future was buried on a lonely hill. But he was wrong. His future was right here, on this porch, in this house, in the love of the children who had saved him. It had been there all along, just waiting for him to open the door. If you were moved by Willis's journey and the power of a chosen family, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know when the next story of hope will appear in the most unexpected of places.